So while in the last part of the chapter we talked about how nationalism can be a unifying force, today what we're going to talk about is how nationalism can be a disunifying force, or a force that is going to tear nations apart. As you can see here on this map, some of these empires had lots and lots and lots of different ethnic groups, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is what this is a map of, certainly did. As you see, each different color is a different dominant ethnic group in that area. So you've got Germans and Hungarians and Romanians and Italians and Czechs and Croats and Poles and Serbs and Ukrainians and just everybody. And they're all ruled by Germans. And not all of them liked that because it was they had cultural differences and things like that. And so, yeah, that's where we'll start. We'll start with Austria. And if you look at this, this is the flag of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And you'll see it's actually like two parts. And the reason for that is that eventually the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which used to be simply the Austrian Empire, is really going to become two separate kingdoms within one empire. And we'll talk about how that happens here in just a minute. So by the time 1800 rolls around, the start of the 19th century, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in some parts of Europe, not particularly in Austria yet, but the Habsburgs are the ruling family of Austria still, and they're the oldest dynasty in Europe. They've been in control of their empire for longer than any other family has controlled the country that they're in. And like I showed you a minute ago, they have tons of lands of different peoples underneath their rule. Austria-Hungary, Bohemia, which is basically where the Czech Republic is now. Parts of Poland, Romania, Ukraine, Italy, all of these modern-day nations, part of them were inside the Habsburg Empire. Bosnia-Herzegovina, several of them. The capital was Vienna, and now Vienna was an amazing place. It was truly an imperial city. It was built to be like that. They had done a lot of urban renewal renovations to the city over the centuries, most recently only a few decades before 1800s. So they had opera house. The very first public opera house was in Vienna. They had museums. They had palaces. They had big wide streets and parks and all of these things. It's just a beautiful city. And it still is a beautiful city. And it was a center of culture and fashion for all of that part of Europe. Music just flourished there. This is where Mozart was, for example. And so it's a very cultured, very genteel, very aristocratic sort of situation that they had. And that's going to resist changes from below. Now, at the Congress of Vienna, after Napoleon's final defeat, Metternich, who was the Austrian foreign minister and the current emperor at the time, a fellow by the name of Francis I, really, they kind of wanted to turn the clock back. They wanted to reverse all of the changes, all of the ideas and sentiments that the French Revolution had given to not just France, but really all of Europe. It's Metternich who will say, for example, that when France sneezes, Europe has a cold. And so, whatever France does affects everyone. And he kind of resented that, really. But Francis and Metternich, basically what they really want is to not have any of these liberal democratic changes applied into their country. They wanted to, as it says here in a quote, rule and change nothing. They refused to provide a written constitution. They limited industrialization, even though they had the money to do it. Excuse me. Even though they had the money to do it. But they will eventually start industrializing because they see themselves slipping in power and influence compared to their great German rival Prussia, as well as other nations such as France and Britain, which had already started industrializing. And they don't want to fall any further behind. And now, as I mentioned before, there were lots and lots of different ethnic groups, different peoples or nations living within Austria. The emperor, he didn't care about that. Francis I is known to have said, "Peoples, what does that mean? I know only subjects." Meaning that the important thing was not whether they were Serbs or Hungarians or Germans or whatever, but that they were subjects of the Austrian imperial throne. And to him, that was what truly mattered. But only about 25% were Germans by the mid 1800s. And so you're going to start to see nationalist revolutions, pro independence revolutions break out in 1848. There's that year again. France had a revolution in 1848. The Prussians had a revolution in 1848. The Austrians are going to have a revolution in 1848. It's just one of those things. It just spreads all over Europe that year. The Austrian army will crush them, however. They will crush them. But Francis will die in 1848, and his son Franz Joseph becomes emperor. Now, Franz Joseph is a young man. He's only 18 years old at this time. And he's going to live quite a long life. And he will rule for almost 70 years. He will pass his title on in 1916. But he will rule for most of the rest of the certainly the rest of the century and well into the next one. So he had a very long reign. It was not, however, one of the more successful reigns. Just because it was long didn't mean it was truly successful. He fought a couple of wars in the early years and lost both badly. One against the Italians with the French allies, and one against the Prussians, the 7 Weeks' War. And we've talked about both of those in the last section a little bit. But in order to keep the people happier, to mollify the people, because they're really upset about all these. It's like, hey, you're this king who doesn't really know us, doesn't really like us, doesn't really any of these things. And on top of that, while you're charging us all these taxes to fight wars, you're losing the wars, and so they're pretty unhappy about it. And so, in order to sort of calm things down, Franz Joseph will agree to granting a constitution and an elected legislature. However, he sets it up so that the legislature will always be dominated by Germans, by people of German ethnic background, rather than any of the other subject peoples. After the loss to Prussia, the Hungarians they'd had enough. Now these guys, it's by far the largest of the other ethnicities besides Germans. They pretty much equaled the Germans in number, pretty close to equal. And so they said, "You're going to have to reform more. You must. We demand it." And so the result is going to be what becomes known as the dual monarchy. And that's literally what it is. They split the crown to two. Hungary is officially an independent nation from Austria. Franz Joseph will rule Hungary as the King of Hungary and rule Austria as the Emperor of Austria. So two crowns for one guy. It's similar to when the British king, he was like James I of England, the Sixth of Scotland. Same thing, okay? Where he was the James I in England, but in Scotland, where he was also king, he was James VI. Same kind of thing. Franz Joseph is going to personally be the monarch of two separate nations. Now, the two countries shared some things. They shared their finances. They shared the defense ministry, and they shared the foreign ministry. But everything else was separate within them. They had their own legislatures, and they basically, I mean, they worked together well enough. I mean, they hold the thing together for another, call it 50 years, but it's not, it's not a real happy union. I mean, they get along okay, but the Hungarians would really much prefer to be left to their own devices totally. And after World War One, they would be. And so this dual monarchy idea basically, quiets down the Hungarians. They're happy enough with it. But what about everybody else? Because, like we said a while ago, there's a dozen or so different nationalities within Austria-Hungary. The Slavs were especially unhappy because they were treated especially poorly. The Czechs up in Bohemia were super unhappy. The Serbs down in the Bosnia-Herzegovina province, which is going to become, well, it's now Bosnia-Herzegovina. It will become part of Yugoslavia for a while. And everything, they want to secede from Austria and join an existing Slavic state. In the case of Bosnia-Herzegovina, they want to join Serbia because most of the people living there were Serbs, and Serbia is right across the border. And so tensions like these are part of what's going to help cause World War One. And yeah, that's where everything is leading to at this point, guys. Where everything is pointing towards World War One. All right, so let's move on now to the Ottoman Turks. I know it's not in the order that was originally announced up the beginning of this thing, but deal with it. Let's try to keep our minds flexible a little bit here, okay? So we're going to move into talking about the Turks. At the height of their empire, the Ottoman Empire was big, strong, and very wealthy. They were very scary to much of Europe, especially Eastern Europe, places like Austria, uh, where they were looking at these Turks who were Muslim and didn't speak languages that most people understood, and were just flat out different and fierce, very fierce and expansionistic, and all of these things. And it was quite scary for Christian Europe to look and see how big and powerful the Ottoman Empire was. But that's at its height. Okay, by the late 1800s, it is not there anymore. They've really lost essentially control of all of North Africa. Theoretically, Egypt is still and North Africa are still a part of the empire, but it's mostly in theory. Uh, they have the coastal regions of Arabia. Nobody goes out into the middle of the desert. Well, I say nobody. The Bedouin nomads are the only ones who go out into the middle of the desert in the center of Arabia there. Um, their real strength is in that region that says Anatolia. That's where their greatest strength is. So what's happened? I mean, the Ottomans were these Turkic-speaking Muslims who had come out of Asia, and they'd conquered all of this area, and they took Constantinople away from the Christians, and they conquered the Holy Land, and they controlled all of this, and all the way up through Greece and Macedonia and all of this region, and threatening up into Vienna. I mean, they were very scary to the Austrians because they're so big. But what ends up happening is they conquer all of this, and then as they attempt to assimilate it, they either don't assimilate or they assimilate too much. There's not a lot of in betweening. And what that means is if they don't assimilate, then the people continually look at these Turks as oppressors and the bad guy, and those Turks took your great great grandfather's house away from him. No, those dirty so and so's. I mean, nothing. That's one way of looking at it. The other is looking at it as if they were helpful, And basically that applied to only the people who were kind of at the top, who the Turks sort of wisely kept at the top and then put everyone else below them. So that helped them keep the loyalty of the sort of middle management. But commercial, technological, and industrial development in Europe will rather quickly leave the Ottomans behind, just like it will Russia. And that's a problem because the uh, when the Allied forces show up, the Turks really aren't prepared truly to fight. Um, they have some advantages when that happens, but we'll discuss that probably more when we talk about World War One. So nationalist revolts are going to start tearing up the Ottoman Empire. The Serbs revolt actually twice. The first time they fail, but the second time they get their independence from the Turks in 1817. Southern Greece will do that as well 15 years later with help from the British and the French and Russia. Other subject peoples revolted time and time again. They weren't successful, but they kept trying. Basically, the Ottomans are losing their grip on power. They've essentially allowed Egypt to chart their own course. By the late 1800s, Egypt is essentially a vassal of the British and not the Ottomans any longer, for example. And all of this makes the Ottomans look pretty weak. And so while it had been the big bad guy, now it's sort of the sick old man of Europe. There was a time when they were the terror of all Christendom, and now they just are looking kind of sad and pathetic. Now, as these smaller nations, in particular in the Balkans, gain their independence, um, they they don't just struggle against the Ottomans; they struggle against each other. Partly for territory, but partly, and I think really the larger part, because they simply don't like each other. They've been neighbors for a very long time, and they don't really much trust one another. They don't really like each other too much. Now, they also wanted to avoid being dominated by a different great power. They don't want Austria or Prussia or Russia or the French or the British to come in and take them over just like the Ottomans had, because then what's the point of that whole revolution that they just fought? They wanted to be independent of all of that. And so that's what they pushed for. And this leads to the region being called the Balkan powder keg. Basically, there's just a ton of tension, and things are ready to just blow up and let loose at any moment from any of a dozen different ways. And eventually, in July of 1914, that is, in fact, going to happen. There will be that spark, and it explodes in 1914 into World War One. And now moving on to our third teetering empire, on the verge of collapse on the eve of World War One. And that's going to be Russia, Zarodina, the motherland. And Russia is huge. Look at this map. It extends all the way across. You've got to curve everything because the planet is curving so much you can't just draw it flat. It's so big. How big? Well, it stretches across all of Asia and half of Europe. It's huge. And if you lived there and you were a boyar, life was good. Now remember, the boyars are the nobles, right? If you were a noble, life was pretty good. You probably had money and a comfortable life. Everybody else has it pretty darn rough, though. And that's all the way through the 19th century. The Tsar resisted any reforms that might undermine their rule. These are the Romanov Tsars. They've ruled for quite a while. They're going to rule for a bit longer. And they just flat out ignore anything that could potentially lower their power. They're not interested in even hearing about it. No thanks. No way. Russia had essentially no middle class, very little. You were either the wealthy boyar types or you were a poor peasant. There were some wealthier peasants, but it, it, it was very relative. The wealthy peasant might own a couple of pigs, um, rather than raising pigs for someone else, for example. Um, Most people in Russia were still serfs. And if you recall that from way back when we talked about medieval Europe, I mean, this is a system that's been going on in Russia for hundreds and hundreds of years. And most people were still bound to the land and not allowed to leave. So Russia had its share of absolutists, absolute rulers. Tsar Alexander the First in the early 1800s, when it went from 17 to 1800, he's the guy that fought against Napoleon and then fought with Napoleon, then fought against him again. He's afraid of Napoleon, and even though he had talked about some liberal reforms like freeing the serfs, he was afraid to do it because doing so would cost him the support of the boyars. He thought without the boyars he couldn't fight off Napoleon, and so he left the serfs alone. Although personally, he really wished he could have done so. His son is going to be Nicholas the First. Nicholas uses the secret police extensively. These are the oprachniki. And so he used them to crack down on liberals and anybody that would basically criticize the empire. He will exile over 150,000 people to Siberia, basically sending them out there to work, freeze, and starve to death. Um, that was what they did, and he basically balances his rule on three legs. So it's a sort of a tripod or three pillars of his society, and those are orthodoxy by making strong ties to the Orthodox Catholic Church. That's not the same as the Roman Catholic Church. Um, they believed in autocracy, the absolute power of a single individual. That would be the Tsar. And and nationalism, which was respect for Russian traditions and suppression or contempt for non-Russians. Basically, if you weren't ethnically a Russian, they wanted you gone or assimilating as much as you could, as fast as you could. Now, Russia is going to fight a fairly serious war because they tried to take land away from the Ottomans down in the Balkans. And the reason for that was because the they wanted a warm water port. The Ottomans control access to the Black Sea because of where their land is. It's right at a point, it's called the Straits of Bosporus, where the Black Sea connects to the Mediterranean and then out to the Atlantic and everything. Now, the Russians use the Black Sea as a warm water port. Even though the water's not really all that warm, it doesn't freeze. It's not a cold port like most Russian ports are. And so they built port facilities and things down there. But because the Turks control those straits, and they're very narrow, the Turks basically control whether or not the Austrian, or not the Austrians, pardon me, the Russians can come in and out of their own port, and the Russians don't like that. So they go to war with the Ottomans over it. And Britain and France are going to intervene on the Turkish side, helping the Ottomans against the Russians. And they're going to get involved in a war on the Crimean Peninsula, which is in modern-day Ukraine. And it's an ugly war. It's a bad war. The French and the British are in no way really prepared for this. The British in particular, their leadership is terrible. The only good thing to come out of this for the British, besides the fact that they do eventually win, is that Florence Nightingale, the Lady with the Lamp, as she was known, comes to the Crimea, sees the horrific conditions, and then begins a nursing corps. And she'll have started the very first military nursing corps ever. And this is, they work very hard to keep themselves respectable and things, but it's a big step. It's a big step outward for middle class women to get the training to become nurses and really take care of patients rather than just sort of sitting there watching them die slowly, which is pretty much all that nurses had used to do before. And so although the French and the British, they fight terribly, they suffer huge losses. Hunger and disease kill most of the men, if not the vast majority. They do kill more of the men than anything else. And yet the Russians still lose the war. With all the advantages on Russia's side, they're closer to home. They don't have as far to take their supplies. They've got all of these things going on. They still don't win. And that's because they don't really trust one another. So they just can't really work together. Without a doubt, the most famous incident in the Crimean War is this one that's illustrated here. It's called the Charge of the Light Brigade. And basically what happens is, because of poor leadership on the part of the British, some orders get passed around that are very vague, and the British light cavalry commander orders a charge straight at a whole bunch of Russian cannons, and they get blown to bits, is the long and the short of it. And this painting here is what those soldiers would have looked like. It's a place called the Battle of Sevastopol in the Crimea. And there's a poem written by Alfred Lord Tennyson about it that says, "Theirs is not to reason why, theirs but to do or die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. And they ride through, and they come back, and at the end, it's there are no longer 600 of them." Okay, so Nicholas I dies in 1855 during the Crimean War, and his son Alexander II agrees to reforms demanded by the people as a result of the loss to the British, the French, and the Ottomans. One of the things he'll do is emancipate the serfs. This is in 1861, the same year that the American Civil War starts. He agrees to create a system of local elected governments called zemstvas. He begins to require trial by jury. He passes a law that says that people have a right to be tried by a jury and not just by a boyar or the boyar's superior. He reforms the military. One of the things he starts doing is promoting based on merit rather than just the fact that your granddaddy was the great Duke of Lower Nowhereistan, and begins to do promotions of officers within the army based at least partly on merit. And he begins to encourage industrialization. He's one of the most effective reformist czars since Peter the Great. You remember him. And he does a lot. He does a lot to change and modernize Russia. But it doesn't make him real popular. By and large, people don't really like change all that much. And so many Russians were still unhappy. The peasants were no longer serfs. Yay, they're free, but they don't own any land either. Because he didn't take the land away from the boyars, he simply took the serfs away. So essentially, their lives don't change very much. The educated liberals, who there were a few of them, not many, wanted a written constitution and a national elected assembly. They don't have those things, and Alexander's not ready to give those things up. Socialist ideas begin to spread into Russia, And some of the more radically disappointed people who become socialists decide that the thing to do is to kill Alexander II. And they succeed. They succeed in assassinating him. And his son, Alexander III, becomes czar. And he responds to his father's murder by going back to the bad old days. He is really, really wanting to go back to the absolute monarchy of old, and he increases the power of the secret police. Now they're known as the Okhrana. If you spoke out against him, he either sent you to Siberia or chased you out of the country altogether. And he promotes an idea known as Russification. Basically, he wants everyone to be more Russian-like. And this is going to lead to what are called pogroms. And a pogrom is a sort of violent attack against people of a particular ethnic group. And it could be entire villages that were being attacked. Okay. Many times this is going to mean the Jews. There were a great many Jews living in Russia, particularly over in European Russia. And because they were different, that marks them out to be scapegoats. Same sort of thing that's going to happen over in Nazi Germany a little bit later on. But this is a lot less organized. Surprise, surprise, the Russians were less organized than the Germans. That should probably not shock any of you. Anyway, so yeah, it was sort of a random thing. It was often just a bunch of peasants going through, and just they would see that the Jewish neighborhood seemed to be doing better than the Christian neighborhood, and so those Christian Polish would run off and attack, and sometimes just harass, sometimes destroy property, sometimes beat up, and sometimes kill the people of, for example, the Jewish villages. And that, of course, is going to push a lot of Jews to get out of Russia. Alexander III and his son Nicholas II will finally begin the process of industrializing Russia. They want to build railroads. They've got this massive country, and nobody can get anywhere. I mean, it took months to cross Russia. And so they want to build, in particular, a Trans-Siberian Railroad, and they will eventually do so, which would link European Russia and Asian Russia, and it goes all the way across over to the Pacific from Moscow. And so they connect all of that area into Moscow. And it's not a great track, it's not a great train system, but it's an impressive still feat of engineering considering the tools they had to work with. As elsewhere, rapidly industrializing causes social problems. Nobles need peasants to farm their lands, or that land just sits there doing nothing and not making anybody any money. It's just totally unprofitable. So they're not happy about these changes. The cities get overcrowded as the peasants leave the farms and crowd into the cities looking for a better life and better jobs and things, and finding out that maybe it's not so easy to get all of those things. This is going to lead to conditions being ripe for radicals to promote their agenda amongst the working class. And one of the groups is going to become known as the Bolsheviks, and they're socialists who deliver and distribute Marxist literature, okay, the ideas of Karl Marx. One of these young radicals is named Vladimir Ulyanov. That's his real name, but most people know him as Vladimir Lenin, who will be the first ruler of the Soviet Union. Nicholas II will continue a long, long line of losing wars for Russia. when he loses the Russo-Japanese War from 1904 to 1905, further damaging Russian prestige, further damaging the Tsar's prestige, and causing people to start thinking more and more revolutionary thoughts. Protests will spring up in cities all across Russia. One in St. Petersburg, the capital, was ruthlessly suppressed. And by ruthlessly, I mean people were shot and then ridden down by armed men with horses. And that leads to a pretty nasty reaction to what becomes known as Bloody Sunday. One of the reactions is the Revolution of 1905. And it's not an overthrow of the system, it's a massive reform of it, however. Nicholas is forced to announce reforms. He creates a national elected assembly known as the Duma. Voting laws kept the Duma very conservative, however, so there's not a lot of change going on there. Radicals remained very unhappy and stayed violent. The prime minister, a fellow by the name of Pyotr Stolypin, was assassinated as well. Just like, oh goodness, what's his name had been? Alexander the Second had been. And so, for not going far enough in things. So, it's a time of a lot of turmoil. And so you can see that the vast majority of people in Russia were simply just not happy with the entire situation. The czars of the last half of the 19th century had not done a good job dealing with issues of industrialization, dealing with problems of nationalism. One of the reasons they started the wars was they were hoping that having a good war where they beat the enemy would help bind the nation together, make people feel pride to be Russian and everything. Of course, they kept losing. And so this unrest is finally it's going to simmer for years, decades. And it's finally going to lead to a widespread revolution right in the middle of World War I. Hey, guess what? That's where we're going to call it today. So you need to start reading chapter 24. Make sure that you have taken all the quizzes. Make sure that you're keeping an eye out for those. We've got a test coming up next week, I believe it will be. And we'll talk to you again soon. Have a good time.